With countries like China and Saudi Arabia constantly building bigger and bigger, there are hundreds of megaprojects currently under development in the world. But sometimes things don't go according to plan. Sometimes multi-billion-dollar projects end up being totally useless, abandoned, or worse. Here are the 15 most useless megaprojects ever built. Number 15. Transit Elevated Bus. The idea for an elevated bus was conceived by two American architects in 1969, but it wasn't until 2010 when China decided to pick up and go ahead with that project. Their Transit Elevated Bus, or TEB for short, was designed to be the bus of the future. As the name suggests, the TEB would run on a track above cars, therefore bypassing traffic and freeing up some much-needed space on the crowded roads. In 2016, a scale model was finally built showing off just how efficient the TEB would be. The TEB would run along a fixed route, and the width of its passenger compartment would cover 2 traffic lanes, with the entire apparatus being about 15 feet tall. It would also be powered using electric lines above the routes and reach a top speed of about 27 miles an hour. On paper, the Transit Elevated Bus was an amazing idea. It would fit about 300 people at a time, take up less space, and run essentially emissions-free. But it proved to be too expensive and too ambitious, and many said that the technology had not yet caught up to the concept. So in 2017, the prototype was scrapped indefinitely, and people associated with the project were even detained under suspicion of investment fraud. But perhaps one day the technology and the money will be there to make this amazing futuristic bus concept a reality. Number 14. Ordos, China. When the Chinese government wanted to increase their gross domestic product, they came up with the concept of the Kangbashi district of Ordos. The new district would sit about 18 miles out of the main city, and the roads alone cost $352 million to lay. The homes of the Kangbashi district took around 5 years to be completed, with many being sold. But there was one thing missing. The civic amenities like schools, shops, and restaurants weren't even close to being done. China's Kangbashi district wasn't able to build its own sufficient economy. It was more of a husk of an idea than an actual community. While the population is slowly growing, with around 100,000 residents today, there's still not much to do and nowhere to go within the district. Perhaps Kangbashi is meant to be a long-term endeavor, but until then, it's the largest ghost town this world has ever seen. Number 13. Lavasa, India. If you build it, they will come. Maybe one of your dad's favorite movie quotes of all time, but that doesn't make it true. Back at the turn of the century, when our excitement over the future was mixed with our fears of the looming Y2K, the term smart city was becoming popular in the hope that our everyday lives would live up to the expectations of new technology. The city of Lavasa in India was designed by the multi-millionaire Ajit Gulabchand, who wanted to take a piece of land with 0 properties on it and kick that number up to a few thousand. It was an ambitious project, to say the least, but Gulabchand was perhaps a bit out of touch with reality. Sure, he may have had the best intentions, hoping to not only put his new city but his new home country of India on the map, but the smart city would soon just become another pointless mega project. This smart city would be in the style of Portofino, Italy, and even have an amusement park to bring as many people in as possible. But Lavasa wouldn't be near any commercial travel routes, meaning no one is coming. The project cost an exorbitant amount of money, much of which was funded by the government and public debt, and the city was designed to hold 250,000 people. But by the end of 2018, only 10,000 remained. The company that built the city and the investors all went bankrupt, and Lavasa was left in a state of total disrepair. Number 12. Forest City Johor. The 20-year project that is the Forest City Johor in Malaysia is a 3,300-acre area that's a mix of residences and over-the-top gardens. It's an incredibly ambitious mega-project, yes, but it's also proven to be much more trouble than it's perhaps worth. For starters, the country set a target of 700,000 units sold, but by 2019, only 500 residents called Johor their home. So as it stands, that's a massive financial failure, and someone has to foot the bill. Problems began even at the start of construction, when cracks and the like began to show in many of the city's buildings and roads. The problem here is that much of the land was reacclimated, and the weight of the infrastructure was preventing the soil from properly settling, therefore causing it to sink, and the city planners all agreed that it would continue to do so over time. Johor was marketed as an eco-friendly and energy-efficient city and has proven itself to be anything but. The damage caused by the reclamation of the land and poor planning has already caused irreversible damage, and corruption is prevalent at various levels of the project. And so it may not be totally fair to call the forest city Johor useless, but it may be fair to call it a pointless and expensive failure. Number 11. American Dream Meadowlands. At least in the United States, malls are a bit of a dying breed, and some may argue the same thing for the American dream. So it should come as no surprise that the American Dream Meadowlands, a mall in the US, falls into that category. The project was proposed in 2003, with construction starting in 2004, with the mall opening in 4 stages from 2019 to 2020. Meaning the mall opened at the height of the coronavirus, right when the world stopped and we were told to stay indoors. The problems didn't even begin there. No, they started much further back in time. The location of the mall in New Jersey's Meadowlands garnered criticism from environmentalists as well as fellow city planners, who noted that the inclusion of this mall, so big that would house theme parks, would only add to the area's horrific traffic congestion. Even the area's NFL team sued the company overseeing construction under the pretense that it would make traffic on game days worse than it needed to be. Couple all of that with the fact that the mall's developer had to pay off close to $300 million in debt, and you're looking at a 587-acre nightmare and money pit that nobody asked for and is completely failing and flailing. Number 10. Naypyidaw. The next entry on our list is another classic case of a massive, sprawling city, but with no citizens to reap the benefits. The case of Naypyidaw in Myanmar certainly is an interesting one, because despite being in one of the poorest countries in Asia, the city is full of gaudy institutions like multiple golf courses, the lower house of parliament, 20-lane highways, and a huge pagoda. Naypyidaw is 6 times the size of New York City, which is home to more than 8 million people. So by that logic, the new capital city, Naypyidaw, should have a similar, if not larger, population. But as of now, less than 1 million people live there, and that number could even partially be fabricated. The government has a very tight hold on the country, and so it's very hard to get the straight truth about the city. It is, however, open to certain levels of tourism, but those who do go to see what the city has to offer are left in complete shock, because this planned city is just about a ghost town. It's estimated that the entire city cost about $4 billion to build, and that doesn't even take into account the non-cash investments. And that doesn't even include the amount of money spent each year to keep the city up and running, paying for things like electricity, water, and even high-speed internet. Number 9. Ashgabat, Turkmenistan. The country of Turkmenistan, unfortunately, has a tumultuous history, with many of its innocent citizens falling victim to forces well out of their control. A former Soviet Union country under the control of the horrific President Saparmurat Niyazov, Ashgabat was built in the hopes of creating a new prosperous era for Turkmenistan, a golden era for the country, and so construction of Ashgabat began in 1991. Gaudy, record-breaking buildings were erected to show off Soviet ingenuity to the world, mostly to the US. And in the end, 543 buildings were made all out of luxury materials, and the newfound city was even home to the world's largest Ferris wheel. Meanwhile, though, the rest of the country, life expectancy was at an all-time low. Today, Ashgabat is referred to as the City of the Dead because it appears to be so empty. The majority of residents live just outside of city limits, and much of the city has no access to electricity or clean water. It's a very strange city that is made mostly of marble, but the fancy facade hides many dark secrets, and while it may be open to tourists, most of them will leave with a bad taste in their mouth. Number 8. The Big Dig. The Central Artery Tunnel Project, or more simply put, the Big Dig, was a Boston-based mega-project set to connect different tunnels, greenways, and bridges, with a large part being connected to the central artery of Interstate 93 into another tunnel. A lot was going on with probably too many moving parts, which rarely ends well. Planning for the project began in 1982, and construction didn't begin until 1991. And eventually ended in 2007. But not because everything was completed and ready to go, but because the partnership between the program manager and the Massachusetts Turnpike Authority ended. No more money and no more workers means no more projects, and the Big Dig turned into one big headache for everyone. During the project, though, the entire endeavor was plagued with leaks, design flaws, delays, going over budget, poor execution and leadership, implementation of cheap materials, cutting corners, and even arrests. The list of issues is a lot longer than it should be, but it all culminated with the death of a motorist. The project was initially supposed to cost $2.8 billion and end in 1998, but instead cost 4 times as much and finished a decade later. Yikes. But the entire project that is the Big Dig won't be paid off until about 2038 and will ultimately cost an estimated $22 billion. Number 7. The Burj Khalifa. Dubai's Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world, home to a 40-mile-an-hour elevator, office buildings, hotels, and a rooftop pool almost 3,000 feet high, also harbors a dark side that no one in Dubai wants you to know about. Where to even begin? Well, the tower cost $1.5 billion US to erect, and about 12,000 migrant workers from Southeast Asia were hauled in to build it, making less than $10 a day and working under some pretty horrendous and unsafe conditions. Many of their passports were even confiscated, so that if they did quit before the job ended, they're trapped in a foreign country. There was one report of a worker falling to his death in 2007, but Human Rights Watch studies speculate that plenty more died of heat exhaustion, overwork, and even suicide. But once everything was said and done and potentially covered up, the powers that be will boast that Burj Khalifa is an environmentally friendly building, recovering the equivalent of 14 Olympic-sized swimming pools a year. Well, that's great, except the building still uses 250,000 gallons of water and burns through the equivalent of 50,000 100-watt light bulbs a day. The building was made to last up to a century, but the Empire State Building in New York is estimated to stand for another 7,000 years. Pile all of this on top of the fact that the UAE is one of the richest countries in the world, but has a 20% poverty rate, and you're looking at one of the biggest wastes of time, money, resources, life, and limb: the Burj Khalifa. Number 6. The Desertron. Better known as the Desertron, the superconducting super collider was the proposed particle accelerator complex that would be the most powerful of its kind in the world. And where better to have one of these bad boys than in Texas? The most famous super collider for a long time was the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, and as always, it was important for the United States to not only keep up with the times, but make sure they do it bigger and better. Work on the Desertron began at the tail end of the 1980s, and they were able to bore 15 miles of tunnels and sink in 17 shafts in a 54-mile radius in just a few years. But it ran up a serious bill, and by 1993, the United States Congress had had enough when the project's budget exploded from $4.4 billion to $11 billion. Having adjusted for inflation, an insane $3.7 billion of American tax dollars were not spent, but wasted on the project. Number 5. Garden Bridge. The River Thames is an iconic attraction in London, England, with an incredibly rich history. So back in 1998, actress Joanna Lumley had suggested creating a bridge that would not only be a floating paradise, but serve as a memorial for the late but beloved Princess Diana. The idea remained dormant until 2012, when it started to gain some momentum, and UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson saw the Garden Bridge concept as his legacy project for London. Cut to 2021, and the bridge is not only non-existent, but the project has been scrapped altogether. So just what exactly happened? Millions of euros were raised for the project, both privately and with public taxes, but delays caused by the utter failure to secure the land rights on both sides of the Thames and the need for more money finally caused the Mayor of London to kill the project in 2017. And while the Garden Bridge could have been amazing with its proposed gorgeous walkways, trees, and flowers, the sheer bureaucracy of the project failed its construction, and the 46.4 million euros worth of public money may as well have been tossed over the bridge into the water below. Number 4. Interstate H-3 Highway. The Interstate H-3 Highway sounds great on paper. It cuts right through the island of Oahu, saving commuters a ton of time in the process. But it didn't save anyone any money when it was built, and it proved to be a massive headache, not just for everyone involved, but for the locals in the region as well. The highway was originally proposed in the 1960s and was met with immediate backlash from the native Hawaiian population, who were able to quickly identify the environmental damage the highway would cause, as well as the historical and cultural landmarks the road would displace. But not only is this interstate geographically unsound, but it was set to be the most expensive highway megaproject on a cost-per-mile basis, with the budget running up a $1.3 billion bill, which is the equivalent of $2 billion today. And despite being proposed in the 1960s, the ball didn't get rolling until the end of the 1980s, amidst all of the protests. The highway finally opened in 1997, but local opposition remains strong even to this day, and many people refuse to even use it, not only on principle, but because some of the indigenous population will tell you it's full of bad mojo. Number 3. Yucca Mountain Waste Repository. Nuclear waste is a pretty terrible thing, and properly getting rid of it is an even rougher process, with the waste taking thousands upon thousands of years for it to truly go away. So needless to say, the Yucca Mountain Waste Repository was an incredibly ambitious project. Too bad plans were made to close it almost as quickly as they were made to open it. For starters, the waste repository was set to be built in the worst location, a seismically active and volcanically active porous area that could never properly contain the waste. And even if everything was left there, the Yucca's aquifer drains right into one of the most productive agricultural regions in Nevada. Then there's the question of space. The Yucca area can contain about 70,000 metric tons of waste, which sounds great on paper, but the waste repository would be totally full by 2036. Then there's the process of getting the waste there. The waste needs to be transported by trucks and trains that travel along routes that would expose over 120 million people. The list of red flags goes on, and how this mega project even got approved is anybody's guess. Number 2. Sochi Olympic Hotels. Olympic athletes train for years for the opportunity to not only compete, but to travel to new and distant locales that they may not be able to normally experience. And when all is said and done, they may be sad to head home. But nobody misses the Sochi Olympics. Despite knowing full well that they would be hosting the Olympics and having a 7-year advanced notice, Russia blew it, big time. Many of the hotels built especially to house the athletes weren't even close to being complete by the time the athletes showed up, and many of them didn't have clean or even running water, and there were even reports of rooms not having any light bulbs or even doorknobs on the doors. It was absolutely terrible. A U.S. bobsledder even got trapped in his own hotel bathroom for so long that he burst through the wall like the Kool-Aid Man. And another athlete went to step into the elevator only to see that the shaft was built but completely empty. You can't make this stuff up, and it begs the question, what the hell happened? People were also living where the hotels were built and were forced to vacate their homes with nowhere to go for this absolutely failed project. It may be easy to laugh at all of the photos the athletes released all those years ago, but the hotels at the Sochi Olympics will probably go down in a dark part of history. Number 1. The World Islands. And now we get to move back over to Dubai for our final entry. Dubai's World Islands may sound like a fun idea, but if you take a moment to sit and really think about it, it's lame and pointless. Composed of 300 man-made islands, one for each country, they're meant to look like a map of, well, you guessed it, the world. Construction began in 2003 and came to a grinding halt in 2008 after the financial crisis. And with 60% of the construction being done by private contractors, this project, while ambitious, was probably doomed from the start. And by 2021, only 9 of the 300 islands are ready for visitors and commercial use. They also require the sand to be moved to the area and require the volume equivalent to 150 pro baseball stadiums to make. But erosion and weather have made quick work of what was already put in place. The islands don't have their own source of electricity either, and the project to run cable under the Gulf was a failure too. But the construction of these fake islands just decimates the local environment, destroying coral reefs and burying oyster beds, therefore killing off the local marine life at an alarming rate. The entire disaster cost $14 billion in a city with a poverty rate of 20%. Watch our future playlist for more top 15 videos about the future. Sit back, relax, and binge watch all of our best future-related videos.